Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Camilla Knight. Camilla, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Really cool to have you on. Really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have. Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, definitely. As you've mentioned there, I'm Camilla. I'm a professor at Swansea University, specialising in the area of sports psychology, but particularly within youth sport. And my particular area of interest is around parents' involvement in sport. So I've had the pleasure of working in that space for the last 15 years or so, ever since I was actually an undergraduate student. So I started my research when I was doing my dissertation as an undergrad, as I'm sure many people have done, and then just was so passionate and excited about that area that I've stayed there ever since.
How come so passionate in this area then? What was it that grasped your interest?
I would say two things really. I grew up playing tennis, and tennis is an interesting sport, and it's often associated with maybe some of what people traditionally call the problem parents. And there's definitely, looking back on my experience, certain behaviours that I witnessed and things from parents that, in hindsight, you're wondering why was that happening, and was that really a good thing? And definitely had a situation with a doubles partner a long time ago who sort of said, we got to win because otherwise there's consequences from my parents. And so I think there was definitely some of those experiences that stuck around. And then on the other hand, my parents committing so much time and, really passionately supporting me and through that, I was very aware of the impact that my sport was having on my parents. I didn't really give it too much thought. You're a kid and you just sort of go with it. But, as I had an opportunity to start to look into that and start to see how my own experiences were maybe impacting on others, that's really what sparked my excitement around this.
That's really interesting what you said there. So you became aware of your participation in tennis, how that impacted your parents. Did that awareness subsequently impact your participation in tennis, your enjoyment of it, or your performances?
I think at that time, potentially, I don't know exactly. I think, definitely as a teenager, I was aware that it was taking up a lot of I always travelled with my dad, so I was aware it was taking up a lot of his time. He was a teacher. He'd finished teaching at 4:00, pick me up. We'd drive somewhere in the country, weekend travel lodge, and then drive home and, get home late at night. So I was aware of the time he was putting in. That never translated in my mind into pressure, but it was definitely an awareness that there was real positives. I got to spend a lot of time with him, but then I was also conscious that, I was taking him away from other people, taking him away from my siblings, etc. And then on the flip side, I laughed with some other parents about this recently, actually. In the summer, in tennis, it's like tournament.
Yeah.
And so I just traveled a lot, and I actually never saw my mum. And so, I'm very close with my mum, and we often laugh about, well, actually, there was all these years where in the summer holidays, I just really didn't, get a chance to see her. So I think, that impact was something I was aware of. I don't think, it ever felt like pressure, but it was just something that made me think, actually, sport is important. And so it's impacting on people, so I need to take it seriously, and I need to, if I'm going to do it, it needs to be something that, I place a lot of importance on. So yeah, they're definitely intertwined in the experience.
So before we get on to our conversation around parental involvement in sports, you played tennis. So come on, Camilla, as a sports psychologist, when you reflect back, how good were you at the mental side of the game?
Absolutely awful. Absolutely terrible. And it's actually the reason why I got into sports psychology. I can almost pinpoint to the day when I said to my dad, I need to work in sports psychology, because at the time when I was playing, I wasn't at the highest level, but, it was important enough to me. And there wasn't any real support, or at that time I wasn't aware of it. Sports psychology wasn't common. And I went on like a 21 match winning streak
Okay.
I had a senior county debut, had a shocking, like, and I was still a teenager, had a shocking weekend and went on a 21 match losing streak and had no way of getting out of it. And I just remember turning to my dad and being like, who's going to help me? How do I, how do I fix this? And that was sort of probably the beginning of the end of my tennis career, if I'm honest. So yeah, no, it was not one of my strengths, but I like to think that's helped me as I've progressed, because I have an empathy and an awareness of maybe what other people are experiencing at times. But yeah, it's definitely not one of my strong points as an athlete.
Well, I think snap, snap, and snap, Camilla, because, my previous golf career, I would reflect back and sort of say, yeah, I wasn't that great mentally. And yes, I didn't know how to help myself, and definitely influenced my career choice now. And also, I'd like to think promotes empathy within me with relation to who's in front of me, the challenges that they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
So very similar experience there. So did you actually, just dwelling a little bit on your background there, so you played tennis to a really good level, and then you said it perhaps influenced your choice of career a little bit, but did you study a first degree in psychology, or did you go the sports science route and then major in sports psychology? How did things evolve for you?
Yeah, so I actually did sports science. So I at 18, I went over to the States on a tennis scholarship, and the
Okay.
opportunity at the university I went to there was, at the time it was called exercise science.
Yep.
I did 1 year there and decided, that wasn't going to work out for me. And so the natural transition was sports science. So then I did my first degree in sports science, straight into a master's in sports psychology before I moved over to Canada, where I did my PhD and was working as a applied sports psych alongside the research I was doing.
So you studied an initial a first degree in sports science. You did a master's in sports psychology and a PhD in sports psychology in Canada, and you fell in love with the psychology of youth sports, and specifically parents' involvement within youth sport. So, starting out there, Camilla, what sort of initial research questions did you have? What were you looking to investigate at the beginning?
So, as I mentioned, my first research was when I was an undergrad student, and I was working with Chris Harwood at the time, and we both had an interest in tennis, so it was naturally going to be around tennis parents. And I had a conversation with my mum one day as we were discussing dissertation topics, and I said, I want to do research around parents. And I think at the time it was maybe parent coach athlete relationships, and I just remember, and I've quoted it before, my mum just saying, well, if you're going to do research on parents, just make sure that you're not telling parents all the things they do wrong. Like, parenting is tough, and we don't need more people coming out and saying this is all of the things that we do wrong. And since I've become a parent, I advocate for that point even more strongly. And so I think off the back of that conversation, I and the experiences I had, I started to think, well, what is it like for parents? What is going on for parents? And that's where I got drawn into the first question, which was really understanding what stresses do parents experience. So when you have children involved in sport, in that case tennis, what's it like? What stresses are they experiencing? What challenges? And so that was my first research, was in that area.
What were your findings there?
That it's really challenging. I was struck just by how emotional parents were talking about it, and actually, there were tears. There was all sorts shared when I was talking to parents, because I'm a qualitative researcher. So we did it through interviews, and parents highlighted just this huge array of stresses. For some it had a larger impact on their lives than for others, but going to competitions, just being there watching children perform and not being able to help, especially in a sport like tennis where, it can all be crumbling and your child has to stay there and they have to finish the match out. You can't sub them off, and as a parent, just sitting there feeling like there's nothing you can do, that really struck me. And those competition stresses, knowing as a parent they're going to be the one who has to pick their child up, say the right things, do the right things, get them mentally in the right space for the next game. That was, really apparent. But that was actually probably was the most emotional part that parents talked about, quite a small part in comparison to all of the organizational stresses, the finance, the time, the impact that had on family life, working life, social life, dealing with issues of perceived favoritism, challenges with coaches, all sorts of things. On the one hand, you got parents saying, we've remortgaged the house to help my child continue in tennis. And, whenever I say that, people go, well, why are the parents doing that? That's just ridiculous. But, parents saying, well, how do I say to my son or daughter that I don't believe in them anymore? That, we've run out of money and I don't support them, So they're really torn, do I put ourselves in financial difficulty or do I tell my child I can't help them? So there's a lot of tension around the finance, and then, a lot of guilt around time spent with other children, not being able to kind of maybe progress in work because they can't put the hours in that they would want to. All of the difficulties that come from organizations not necessarily communicating as clearly as they could, challenges around selection, etc. So that was a really big thing. And then the final one was what I call kind of the parenting part, developmental concerns. Are we making the right decisions? Should my child be dropping out of school or staying in school? Should they be at an academy? What do I do about helping them balance their social life versus their sporting life? And I think what became really clear for me in that early study, and it's really fueled a lot of my work going forward, is just that parents didn't know where to turn. So there's all these different stresses and all these different challenges, but no real support mechanism was in place for them. And so I think that stress was often just building. And, we did do some survey data, and sometimes you just were stressed by the end of reading it because the parents had kind of just offloaded so many things. And there were so many challenges that it went even further than I maybe anticipated.
It's really interesting, Camilla, because as you're speaking now, it's making me think of, and I'm guessing perhaps historically I've been guilty of this, because when I think of parents in sport, there's a sort of an inner feeling within me that it kind of feels a bit ambivalent and a little bit frustrated at some of the parental behaviours. And there's videos out there that talks about poor parental behaviours, whether it's on the sidelines or whether it's in the car on the way home, and maybe the maladaptive ways that parents might engage with their young players on a day-to-day basis around sport. And yet you're painting a picture, a complex picture, a nuanced picture, that maybe the narrative has been quite hostile, and yet it's so important to it's also important, or most important, to empathise with the plight of the parent. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the approach that I've taken, and the approach that I would advocate for. I think the traditional portrayal of parents as these pushy, overbearing, challenging, over-involved people who, the portrayal is almost that they're purposely trying to do it wrong. I think sometimes is so far from the stories that I hear, and so far from the experiences that I hear from parents who are desperately trying to get it right, who are desperately trying to give the best opportunities for their children, which maybe at times does lead to misguided behaviors. And, we do see things that you look at and you go, I'm not sure that's going to be given the best sort of support to the child. But, I've yet to come across a parent who is purposely trying to get it wrong. They're trying within the constraints of, society expectations, family commitments, etc. They're trying to do the best thing. And I think they're often just not tooled with the necessary information or the support to be able to do that in the best possible way. So yeah, for me, I really struggle with a lot of the portrayal of parents, a lot of the campaigns about parents, because they do sort of demonize the sport parent, and they also make an assumption that it's all individual, that it's just simply down to a parent being able to change their behavior, and it takes away any responsibility from the culture or the environment that we're creating. And I find that particularly challenging because we know youth sport's very emotional. We can have a debate about whether it should be or shouldn't be, but it is. It is very emotional. And we all know that when we're experiencing a lot of emotions, it can be very hard to just stay in control of your behaviors and just, well, that's a bad behavior, so I'll do a different behavior. And actually, if we can start to consider the environment and the culture that we're creating, and recognize what changes we could make that maybe reduce some of the pressures that parents are experiencing, reduce some of that emotion, then we might see that there's actually, a reduction in some of those behaviors that we might not want to see. So, I do struggle when we sort of do, I call it the parent blaming culture, where parents should just be able to fix things and do things better. I think the other point on that is that there's also a challenge around, what we think parents should be doing. So, when I see lots of people coming out with, do's and don'ts lists, or, these are all acceptable behaviors, or, those message boards that people like to put up around, things parents should do and things parents shouldn't do, or things they should remember, is that we forget that parenting is unique to the relationship between a parent and a child, and how one child interprets a behavior might be different to how another child interprets it. And actually understanding the complexity of the specific relationship is important before we start to just list behaviors that shouldn't be present.
There's 4 things I've written down that I'd like to have a conversation about all 4 to progress today's conversation: environment, behaviour, identity, and family dynamic. And I wrote those 4 down from what you've been saying there. Let's start with environment. I just think this is fascinating because it's so much more complex and nuanced than perhaps sometimes Twitter memes and lists, as you say, of behaviours make things out to be. Let's start with environment. I just think that's such a pertinent, when I really sit down and think about it, I think it's such a pertinent thing to say. Are you, when you say environment, are you talking about the environment created by the coach, the environment created by the club or the organisation that the child is entering into when they participate in sport? Is that the environment that you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say it's all of those things within the sports environment. And I think all of that is in a broader context of societal expectations in terms of how we judge parents. So there's this good parenting narrative that's, over time encouraged parents to put their children into structured activities that are adult organized. Busy children are good, means you're a good parent, etc. And so, I think there's a general societal narrative that's maybe encouraged parents to sign children up to a lot of sports, maybe stimulated some of these challenges we've got around early specialisation and this push to put children into organised sport. So I think there's a broader narrative and, a broader societal consideration. And then we come into the sporting environment, which is, the environment created by as you said, the environment created by the coach, the club, the selections, etc. I've seen it again recently, a lot of articles coming out, for instance, saying, parents don't push your children into sports too soon, don't get them to specialize too soon. We know that within the academic community, we know there's a lot of evidence about that. But as a parent, when you're confronted with continual advertising for, I got an almost 2-year-old and I'm getting messages about rugby tots for 18 months olds, when you're continually getting messages from a very young age about getting children into sports, and then those programs sometimes having 3, 4, 5 touch points by the time they're 5 or 6, you can see why a parent would end up doing that, because that's what they're encountering, that's the environment they're encountering. So I think there's a big piece around what the youth sport environment is presenting to parents, and then a lot about the coaches. on the one hand, there's coaches who are saying, parents shouldn't care about wins and losses. Parents should be focused on development. And then those same coaches are often posting about the results of their team or the scores or highlighting who, scored goals, etc. And so I think sometimes there's a disconnect, in terms of we expect parents to focus on development and coaches say they do, but maybe their behaviors aren't demonstrating that. Or we're selecting at a young age, and as soon as you start selecting, then that adds an element of competition and an element that as a parent you should be doing more to help your child be in a better position to be selected. So yeah, I think there's a big piece around the youth sport environment that's happening. And then I also think within that there's a big piece around actually how we consider parents. I had a really interesting conversation with some colleagues in Sport New Zealand just yesterday who are doing a big push around their work with parents, and they were talking to one of their sports who had initially thought, well, we can fix parents by doing social media campaigns and highlighting all of the things that they do wrong. But then over some kind of intensive conversations based off, the research that's available, the sports went, oh, actually, the reason that we're having these issues with parents is that they don't trust us. We're not communicating with them. We're not drawing on their expertise. We're not engaging with them. And through having that kind of revelation, they've now changed how they're going to engage with parents at an organizational level. And I'm really excited to see what happens with that, because I think that's going to be much more fruitful than simply expecting parents to change their behaviors.
A few things I wrote down there. I think it's really a fascinating landscape, societal expectation of good parenting. Good parenting being helping children get involved in youth sport, in organised sport. You talked about specialisation. I mean, there seems to be such a confused message out there at the moment. As you mentioned, in academia, we're very much promoting diversification. Although recently I heard a researcher talking about actually it's not specialisation versus diversification that's the critical point here. It's actually early seriousness, which is actually where potentially the biggest challenge lies. But from what you were saying there, it also made me think of if we're spreading this message of the importance of diversification, we're almost further loading on the pressure of parents in terms of, well, young Johnny or young Mary can't just play soccer, they've got to go and play golf. And actually, if they want to be better at soccer in the future, then ballet dancing is going to be really useful here. So
this is something that I raise often, is this idea that we can't just say you have to do more, because some people can't do it. There's financial implications, there's time implications, and I've had some very interesting conversations with parents of slightly older children since the lockdown eased in the UK, and all of the children's activities came back at the same time, and the parents are going, how have we ever done this? Why did we do this? Why do we sign them all up for this? And I said, well, you did one at a time. And when you add one at a time, it doesn't seem so bad. But then you take them all away and you bring all 8 different activities back at once. And you start to see that actually the kids are exhausted going from school to one activity to another activity, and then the next day to another activity to another activity. And so, it's something that I'm very conscious of when we push this diversification message, that, that does add both to children and to parents. And also, I really like the point you made around, it's about early seriousness, because some kids just love one sport, and that is the sport that they want to play. And yes, as a parent, you might introduce other activities, but if they're really determined they just want to play that one sport, you as a parent, you then have to have that conversation in terms of, well, do we stop them doing it if that's really, what they love doing? So you made the point that hopefully I'm reiterating it. It's just complicated. It's much more complicated than maybe we often think when we first start to think about parents and sport and the decisions they make and how they're behaving.
It was making me think there when you emphasize that notion of early seriousness. Just as a child might say, you know what, I love soccer, I just want to play soccer, and that's the only thing that I love. as you said, is that how do we treat that feedback from our children? How do we treat that if we're aware of, let's say, the research, and we're aware maybe of perhaps a safe and healthy involvement for young children or children to be involved in sport is to have the opportunity to diversify and play in multiple sports. Obviously, that impacts our time and our resources, but how do we deal with that? Do we just, as you say, negotiate and say, well, okay, yep, little Johnny, little Mary, you love soccer, so just go and play soccer, and then bringing up the early seriousness point. Actually, again, if we're talking about, let's bring in this notion of autonomy supportive, not just autonomy supportive coaching, but autonomy supportive parenting. If as personality science or developmental personality science has suggested, and we had Professor Dan McAdams on the show a couple of months ago, and his 3 level personality development model, and they talk about a 5 to 8 year old shift, whereby children start to become motivated agents in their world. Now, if a 6, 7, 8 year old, 9 year old says, I love this and I take this seriously, this is important to me, this is serious to me, then where does our problem with early seriousness lie there? I guess it's a child is allowed to take their sport seriously. We as adults have to watch our behaviours around the seriousness of the child.
Yeah, and so, building on that point, I think you're spot on. It's about, how a child judges seriousness would probably be different to how a parent judges seriousness. And I take it seriously means I want to make sure I go and I've got the right kit, versus I'm going to go out and I'm going to have a PB in every set, every set that I do if I'm swimming or something, But I think what you're touching on here is something that we've seen in some of the research that one of my former PhD students, Olivier Roquette, has been publishing, which is around responsive support and the importance of parents providing responsive support. So, that is about understanding your child, demonstrating that you value them and you care for them. And it becomes very specific to the individual. So actually, if you've got a child who's saying, this is really important to me, this is something I want to take seriously, or I want to do this on these days, to say, well, no, actually we're doing this, and it's important that you do multiple sports, so therefore you're going to play other things instead. That wouldn't be responsive. That wouldn't necessarily be acknowledging their needs. Now, responsive does not mean that you do exactly what your child wants. You can still say no, but it's about having a conversation around it and understanding the underpinnings of what it is, they're trying to achieve. And, I think the more that we can start to be responsive to children, the more we can start to really engage with children to try and understand, why is this important and what is important, and, what do they need from me, then the more, we can start to provide for want of a better word, the right support for that child.
It makes me think of the importance of communication and interaction within that relationship, and also negotiation and co-creation. I love that notion of responsive support, Camilla, and it makes me think of something you sent me through a bunch of research papers and something I read in there around. So let's move on to the behavioural aspect of this now, how a parent behaves around their children, what behaviours they engage in. There was a really interesting couple of sentences around behaviour from parents who have a substantial knowledge of the sport their child is engaging in. And I think and hey, look, hands up, I've been guilty of this. I think a blanket statement, a black and white statement, is to say, don't get involved. Even if you're Pep Guardiola and your son plays sport or your daughter plays soccer, don't get involved. But actually, what research, I understand, is suggesting is that's far more nuanced, and the responsive support is actually in the co-creation. Can I be involved here? How would you like me to be involved? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, you are reading that exactly as the research would intend, and it's really important. I just had a conversation with a rugby player yesterday on exactly that point, his dad played rugby. His dad is very experienced. When his dad gives him feedback, that's very valuable to him. That's really important. And when his dad says he had a good game, it means he had a good game. That's very important. He says, my mum will tell me I had a good game every time. She doesn't know what she's talking about. So, it's lovely to hear, but it doesn't mean anything. And, that experience, the relationship you have, the value that you place on the, feedback, it's all very different. And, as a parent, having the conversation around, what would you like from me? And also, how are you receiving what I'm providing? Because we know from the research, that parents and children don't always interpret the same behaviors in the same way. So, a parent might be trying to be supportive, but a child's receiving that in a different way to intended. So having those conversations to really understand, when I clap on the sideline, do you see that as encouraging, or do you see that as me, trying to G you up? Or, do you then interpret silence as a criticism, or do you find silence to be attentive and show that you care? I used to laugh with my dad. My dad was a good all-round athlete, and he'd sit on the sideline when I was playing tennis reading the newspaper, but he always knew exactly what was going on. At the end of a match, he could tell you everything that happened, but he'd read the newspaper like the whole time. And we used to laugh about it, because for me, that was a show that he was relaxed, that it was all fine, whatever was happening. But then other children were like, oh, your dad doesn't care. Like, he sits there reading the newspaper. But for me, I knew what that meant, and so it's very individual, and it does depend on how you're interpreting and how it matches the individual needs.
I'm just in awe of your dad's ability to multitask, Camilla, more than anything else.
Well, I'm not sure how much of the newspaper he could remember at the end, if I'm honest.
Fair enough. And it strikes me, I mean, if we just dwell a little bit on the parent as expert, and really, I suppose, as you're kind of suggesting there, that we have to continue to monitor our behaviours, don't we? Because if we're an expert, and even if we're asking the questions around, well, is what I'm saying helpful, that there could still be an element of the child striving to please the parent as expert, because that becomes the identity of the parent within the child's eyes, that it's not just mum or it's not just dad, it's mum who was the professional soccer player, or dad who's the professional basketball coach or something. That there's again, coming back to this word of complexity, or this word of nuance, that it's enormously challenging there.
Yeah, and even if you've not played at a very high level, we know that at a young age, what parents say is held in great esteem by their children. And, we know that that's often a source of tension when, maybe children enter into kind of performance pathways or academy setups, and they're used to their parent being the person that they turn to, the person, they were the authority, they were the person who really gave that information. So that transition doesn't just happen for children, it happens for parents too, and letting parents have a bit of an opportunity to work out what their new role is, and how do they step back, and how do they, still provide support, but allow the new expert, for want of a better explanation, the coach, to start to take the lead. And I talk to people about this often, that we are increasingly understanding the transitions of athletes and young people, and recognizing the importance of supporting them through that. But we don't really do that for parents. We just sort of expect them to be able to switch and get on with it. I'd actually say it's often a longer process for parents, and it's often, they're often a few steps behind the children, because they've got more things going on, and that, they've been, emotionally, they're so emotionally invested in their child. So I think, understanding that actually, along the journey, and it is a journey that's shared between a child and their parent, that parents are going to have to negotiate transitions and changes, both within sport, but then within life too. And I'm sure, in your own experience, Dan, I'm sure you've encountered this, parents often saying, well, you talk about communication, but how do I talk to a teenager? My son or my daughter used to talk to me, but, now I can't communicate with them, at all. So, parents have to negotiate that change as well. And, there's all sorts of things that, are challenging to manage.
Well, let's dwell on that a little bit. I'd perhaps like to come to the communication piece, but if we were to combine environment and behaviour, Camilla, I think everyone will notice that over the last decade or so, there's been more attention paid to parental behaviour within the club environment, on the sidelines, in the clubhouse, and there can be, whether it's from one-to-one conversations between the coach and the parent, right the way through to blanket policy from clubs, from teams, from organisations around so-called optimal parent behaviours. This might be asking you to provide an opinion or maybe lean on some research. What's your thoughts on those blanket ideas of silent weekend, parents can't say anything or shouldn't say anything, or those kind of blanket policies that clubs have? Positive, negative, somewhere in between. What's your thoughts?
Generally, anything that's a blanket, I'm generally not overly supportive of,
Yep.
unless there's a clear understanding for why. This is going back a good few years. I did some research just for some undergraduate students around those silent weekends, and we talked to some we never published it, but we talked to some young footballers whose parents were allowed to shout and scream and do whatever they want on the sidelines, cheer, etc. And we talked to some players whose were in a competition, and the parents had to be silent, and some children loved it and some children hated it. Some children like it when it's silent because they can concentrate more, they can pay attention to the coaches, they're not worried about what their parents are thinking. And some of them are saying, well, then it's boring, and it's not fair on my parents because they're putting all of this in, why can't they show excitement? Kids watch sport and no one's silent when they're watching sport on TV, so this experience of playing sport is, being changed. So, I think the concern I have with all of these kind of blanket policies is, for some they'll be positive and for others they'll be, not so well received. And I think I can see the benefit of a silent game if the justification is something like, we want the players to think for themselves. We don't want them to be picking up information from their parents.
Yes.
Fine, give a clear explanation for what it is you're hoping that's going to be achieved. But if it's simply, we don't know what to do about parent behaviour, so we're going to tell them all to just be silent, well, that doesn't solve anything, because parents are only on the sideline for like an hour or two. They're in the car, they're at home, they're with their child for many, many more hours than, what we see on the sidelines. So, I think some of the concern I have around a lot of these blanket policies they are simply in response to sideline behaviours. I talked at the beginning about how emotional youth sport is. So you take parents, put them in an emotional environment that's not changed, but all you've said is you now can't express any emotion. And then you put them in the car. Well, the emotion's going to come out, I would anticipate, somewhere, somehow. Those conversations might happen now after the game, or those conversations might happen later that evening. I don't think simply silencing someone prevents, further conversation. So for me, I think when we're just targeting behaviours and not considering more broadly the environments and the support that's available, the impact's going to be very limited. The other thing, and it's something that I'm guilty of in my research, and we're very poor at it within the research published in English language journals, is there's a big cultural element to parenting, and the majority of the research that we've conducted either doesn't explicitly give you any indication of ethnicity or culture, or it's being done in North America in predominantly white middle-class two-parent families, or in the UK, or some European countries. So the evidence that we have around what's optimal parenting, or the best type of youth sport parenting, is very limited in terms of an understanding of the range of considerations for parents. And When you talk to people involved in different sports, where, maybe predominantly different ethnicities are involved, what parents are bringing, what parents are, enacting as a parent, what they're expecting, it's all different. And so we can't just have blanket statements of this is how you should respond that's based on, a North American, British, white, middle class parenting ideal. It just, it's just not appropriate.
I suppose, thank you for pointing that out at the end, because I think that's such an important point about differing lenses based on cultural norms, cultural differences. You've spoken to individual differences there. You've spoken to cultural differences, other cultural norms away from, as you say, a kind of a westernized viewpoint. I suppose I'm just thinking coaches listening in and shrugging their shoulders and sort of thinking, well, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. What on earth do we do here, Camilla? Because if we've got all these individual differences, it's almost bears relationship with, as I'm sure you'd appreciate, bears relationship, doesn't it, as a sports psychologist working with the team and all these individual differences, and you're working with coaches and they're going, well, I've got to create a team. I've got to have some messages that have to work blanket across the team. So individual differences, differing cultural perspectives, differing cultural norms. Do we just have to accept that it's so complex that we're never going to get it completely right? We've just got to strive to get that environment as best as we possibly can as a coach. And there's going to be a lot of balls that we're going to have to juggle in the air, and they're going to fall from time to time. Or are there some straightforward messages and environmental practices and behavioural norms that clubs, teams can engage in to I suppose improve the parent experience and the parent-child relationship within that club?
I think to start with, we're never going to get it all right.
Yes.
I think no one's going to ever get it all right. But I think what's important as a coach, or what's important as a sports psychologist, if you're working in this area, is recognizing that there are certain things that you can support which allow for individual difference. So we've talked a lot about communication, so as a coach, providing opportunities for parents and children to communicate around parental involvement, whether that's in small groups or within their individual in the individual dyadic relationship, will allow, more, the potential for more optimal involvement. Facilitating communication in that way, having conversations with parents around expectations, but not where you as a coach or sports psych list the expectations, but where you collectively co-construct those as a group of parents. What are you expecting from each other? What will you hold each other to? How would you like people to react to the children in different situations? Developing that together again allows some of that individual difference to be accounted for. And then one of the big pieces for me is about what I like to term a parent positive environment. Can you create a parent positive environment? So can you, as a coach or sports psych, create an environment where ultimately parents feel welcomed? Because a lot of the time parents don't feel welcome in the environment. And how you do that might be simply getting to know parents' names, getting to know, a little bit about them. While children are warming up, doing a little lap, checking in, making sure, people are there. If you've got the opportunity at the facilities, are there teas and coffees? Is there a chance for, people to bring siblings if needs be, or sit somewhere and get some work done? So there's some relatively simple things around, helping parents to feel welcome, which again, within there, I think you can account for individual differences and cultural norms. Are you creating an environment in which parents are respected? How you're responding to parents, how you're receiving feedback from parents. Do you give opportunities for parents to understand what's going on? Anyone who's heard me speak before knows I talk about whiteboards all the time, but it's such a simple thing. Put a whiteboard at the side of a pitch, which gives a brief overview of, what you're doing today and why. And then suddenly parents feel valued. This is now something they can talk about with their child. You can all be on the same page. And again, I think these are simple things that, cut across individual differences. And then the final one for me is, are you creating an environment where parents feel valued? I've had the good fortune to work in a football academy, and I remember, the coaches getting a little bit nervous around review meetings with parents and release meetings. And, I just said, do you ever thank the parents? What if you started the meeting off by thanking them for everything that they've done? And as soon as you start to do that and you show parents that you value what they're doing for their child, some of that tension diffuses, and actually parents recognize they are seen as part of the journey. So, I think there's certain things within an environment that you can do which would, facilitate positive parental involvement that does cut across, some of the individual differences. I think as soon as you start tying yourself to very tight codes of conduct, list of, behaviors that are not acceptable, carding parents, banning parents, all of those sorts of things, then I think you start to run into the cultural individual differences challenge. And don't get me started on the consequence that has for children. If your parent's the parent that gets carded on the sidelines and you've got to carry on playing, I can't think of anything more traumatic for a child within a youth sport competition.
It just sounds awful. Red card, off you go, into your car, back home. I love that term, parent positive environment. And there's lots of things you said there, but what really hit home for me was the distribution of information and how important that can be, or disseminating information such as the whiteboard idea. And really, I suppose in many respects, Camilla, selling the what, the how, the why. What are we doing? How are we doing it? Why are we doing it this way? Which actually feels like not just a prevention of future or potential conflict, essentially, because if you can articulate the what, the how, the why, especially the why, it becomes just a better discourse, a better conversation, and a clearer one. Just moving on to the identity piece here, it struck me, as you were speaking earlier, that being a sports parent must influence, change, form, identity. You become, Camilla, the soccer parent, perhaps, or Joe, the basketball dad. That must be quite, well, I don't know if it's hyperbole to say life changing. Your identity changes. Possibly your habits, your behaviours change as a consequence. No question, really, Camilla. Just I wondered if there's any thoughts or research in that area of identity.
To my knowledge, nothing explicitly, just focused on that identity. There's definitely been research, for example, Nikki Clark in her research around understanding from parents' perspectives as their children went into football academies. There was definitely a piece in there around this shift in identity. Now my child is an academy footballer, and that means I am a football parent. And there's definitely some positives for parents there. They're proud, and that is something that they like to see. But it comes with this whole host of challenges of, well, now I need to be making sure that I'm doing the right things to help them to progress, and I've got this important role of fulfilling this role. But I think it made me smile as you were introducing this question, because you said, Camilla, there's such and such a parent, or Joe, there's such and such a parent. These sports parents don't even get names. Often, so we just broadly say you're just a sport parent. And it's the same as when you become a parent. I've probably not surprisingly been very aware of it since I became a parent, that I'm just called mum a lot, and I want to go, I am mum, but I'm not your mum. You're an adult talking to me. You can call me Camilla, or, you could take the time to learn my name. And it happens from the moment you have a child, and then when your child enters a sport, we talk about it. Now you're a sport parent, and we, in assigning this label, we almost make you this homogenous group where all your individual differences, all your expertise, all your knowledge just goes, and now you're just this sport parent. And it's actually, I've got a student doing some research around it, and it's something that I've been interested in for quite a while, because for me, I think it links into a lot of the safeguarding issues. And when we kind of just, bunch all of these parents together as sport parents who, their problems, we don't really want to deal with them, we'll ignore all of their background and their knowledge, and we'll treat them as these people who don't really know a lot, and the coach is the expert. Well, now we're positioning them to never challenge you, to maybe feel like they can't advocate for their child in the same way. And it's been a real, as we've seen a lot of these safeguarding cases unfold, and people go, well, how did the parents let it happen? And I go, well, if you've spent time in the youth sport environment and you see how we position parents and how we take any power away from them by just labeling them as, this sport parents and problem, highlighting them as problems, I can see how it happens. You can really see how it happens. So I think that there's definitely some, life-changing things that happen, for parents when, children progress in sport, particularly on maybe more of the performance pathways. But I think more broadly than that, this collective identity as a sport parent, I think, could have some very serious ramifications within the environments that we're currently seeing.
And finally, must have an impact on the family dynamic. Coming back to the seriousness of sport, coming back to the resources, coming back to the time, coming back to those things being finite, I suppose. I'm not going to have a question here, Camilla, but there must be enormous pressure on, or can be enormous pressure on, the family dynamic that comes with involvement in sport participation, and then perhaps seriousness. And I suppose it returns to, I experienced this as a young golfer for my family, and it comes back to your experience and how you felt about that perhaps that family dynamic with your family. Again, is the literature rich in this area, or is it growing?
With regards to kind of the impact on the family, there is evidence there, and it's quite recognised that it causes guilt for parents, it can cause challenges for siblings, it can cause ongoing tensions, within families going forward, limited time as families, people having to select, who do we spend time with, not getting to go on holidays, often leaving children with relatives or other people. So definitely that's very clear in terms of the impact that it can have, and often, and again, that's sometimes a little bit mitigated if you're in a two-parent family where maybe you divide and conquer and you have one parent with one and one parent with another. But increasingly in single-parent families, that's a particular challenge. If you've got multiple children and you've either got to be in multiple places at the same time, or you've got to make a decision, who am I backing here? Who am I taking to what activity, and how am I negotiating that? And, for me, we did some research recently where one of my students talked to children about, what do you want from parents? What would make this sport the most fun and enjoyable for you? And then we took those things to parents and we said, what would prevent you, or what would facilitate you being able to do this? And it was so apparent, the difference between a two-parent family and a one-parent family, a family with only one child versus a family with multiple children. Working schedules. Are you in a flexible job, or are you in a 9-to-5? There's all these sorts of factors that impact on what parents can do. And I think, unless you understand the family dynamic, unless you understand the family and all of those things, when we put this list or these expectations out for parents, we're often setting them up to fail because they simply cannot do it. It doesn't work within their makeup. And so that's where I think, kind of coming full circle on what we've talked about here, understanding parents and empathizing with parents is so important, to allow you to then, whether you're a coach or a sports psychologist, provide guidance, advice, support, which they actually can take on board and, successfully achieve. And because otherwise we're just saying, do all of these things, but they're just not able to do it.
So to finish off, putting you fractionally on the spot, giving you the impossible task of cutting through the enormous complexity. We have a lot of coaches listening in. What might be Professor Camilla Knight's top 3 tips for coaches when either dealing with parents or the kind of environment they're trying to form with relation to parent behaviour? What would be your top 3 tips?
My first one, and you triggered it with the way you've just set this question up. My first one would be, away from the environment, whether it's before a season, or whatever, is spend some time thinking, actually reflecting on what do you think about parents. So you use the word dealing with parents, and that's a big red flag for me. But is that what you think? And if you are taking as a coach the approach of dealing with parents, well, then you're setting parents up as kind of the enemies, probably a bit of a strong word, but as someone that you're going to have issues with, encounter against. Or actually, when you reflect on parents, can you see them as assets, and can you see the positives that come? So I think the first bit is actually, how are you thinking about parents?
You're such a psychologist, Camilla. Really. Just breaking down my language there.
It's only because you said the key phrase that I jumped on.
The key phrase, yeah.
So the first is, as a coach, thinking around that. Then the second one is, I cannot overemphasize the value of communication, frequent and often and open. And not just communication that is, this is the schedule, this is when I want your child, but, these are the things that we're working on. These are how you can support the things that we're working on. Because if a parent knows what you're working on, now they can be an asset and they can help you reinforce it. If they don't know, then they'll talk about potentially the wrong things. But also just communication in general. How are you doing? What's your name, etc. And also communicating around the demands and the challenges that you have as a coach. So, we've talked a lot here around, as a coach, understanding parents, but, helping parents to understand your role as a coach and everything you're experiencing is also important, because, often coaches go, well, parents text me all of the time. Well, have you ever told them that actually you get 20 text messages after every game? And so your one text message is multiplied by, and often they haven't, so yes, sometimes it might feel awkward, but having those conversations early would be really, really important. And then the final one for me would really be around trying to create, in the same way as we talked about responsive support between a parent and a child. As a coach, can you be responsive in your support to your parents? So can you take the time to sort of understand what they need from you, and understand how you can show that they're valued, and I think it's about recognizing that what one group of parents wants might be different to another group of parents, but actually through that frequent communication, you'll get an idea of, what they need and how you can best support them.
Really interesting. Thank you so much for this. This has just been absolutely fascinating hour, and has definitely highlighted, yes, as we frequently said, the complexity, but there are some solutions there, aren't there, Camilla? There are some, whether one describes it as optimal ways or helpful, useful ways to deal with the challenges. Look, thank you so much. I know that people listening in will be interested to learn more. How can people find you if you want to be found? Are you on social media? How can people get in contact?
I'm always happy to talk about parents, so I welcome anyone getting in contact. So they can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is CJ Knight, so relatively straightforward. Or if you just look up Camilla Knight and Swansea University, you'll find all of my details online, email address, etc. And I'm more than happy to chat with people and help people understand a little bit more of how they can translate some of that complexity into practice.
Brilliant. Camilla, thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.